Hi class, it's Miss Miller, and today what I'd like to do is actually take you through 5 distinct stages or 5 steps in about 5 minutes to discuss with you how you can write about a poem. So let's see if we can get it done in a short amount of time. Let's go ahead and begin. Let's take a look at step number 1, which means to explicate. And this is where you take a poem and you discuss in writing line by line. If, for example, you take the poem that's listed below, you will see that you have tons of annotations already. So you have so much to write about. Imagine if you were to write about this poem with no particular purpose or prompt, you just explicate it, then you would actually discuss the poem from line 1 all the way to the very last line. And you would discuss all of the annotations that you have until the end. You may take up 1 or 2 pages. The great thing about this is chances are you aren't going to leave anything out when you explicate a poem. Okay, let's take a look at step number 2, which simply means to divide and conquer. And in this case, we have 2 poems, so I'm really just going to address one. And I really hope you can see this, but what I'm going to do is take my pen over here, and I'm just going to draw a line through the poem. I've divided it. There we go. So let's say here, and I might even do a box. This is section 1, and that is the first body paragraph. And then the second section is simply going to be body paragraph number 2. So as I'm explicating line by line, I'm just going to divide my poem up, and hopefully it can be 2 equal parts. It can be based on the amount of content that you have, but you're going to go ahead and divide it up. And each section will be a paragraph. So this essentially means that you could take one poem, divide it into 3 sections, you're going to have 3 body paragraphs. But to be honest with you, when you're doing an essay, you want to do a 2 body paragraph response. Let's take a look at step number 3, which is to answer the question, because your answer to the question is essentially the thesis statement. Now, if you recall, the writing prompt that we got required us to do several things. We had to look at 2 poems, one by Wordsworth, another by Frost, and then we had to address how each poet dealt with encounters with nature. And not only did we have to talk about that, but we had to talk about the attitude that each poet used in their idea of nature or the individual or being alone. And then we had to also include in our answer the techniques that each poet used. And so if you recall, Wordsworth used a set of techniques for his work to express the encounters of nature and the attitude, and then Frost used something completely different. And thank goodness the prompt was sort of leading this to understand that they were both polar opposites. And once you understood one poem, you really had a good understanding or grasp of the second poem. So that's how you do step number 3, is you make sure you answer all parts of the question. Step number 4 requires us to look at each of our techniques and discuss the impact that each of the techniques have, or at least not each of them, but the significant ones, on the specific line or stanza. And so you want to think about all of your evidence or your techniques and think about, like, let's say, for example, you decided to use alliteration in line 2. So you're discussing the alliteration, and as a result of the alliteration, once you've identified it, that's the easy part, is now you want to say, how does this specific example or evidence of alliteration really contribute to me understanding that particular line, or maybe if it doesn't help you understand the line, stanza in the poem. So you want to talk about the impact that technique has on the line or the stanza. Let's take a look at step number 5, which is the final step of all of this. And this is where you take that same example for alliteration in step number 4, and you say, now that I know how this example helps me understand the line or stanza, how does this contribute to the meaning of the poem as a whole? How does it help me understand the entire poem? And really, in a nutshell, is What do I know now about this poem that I did not know before as a result of this technique or piece of evidence? And so remember, all of this is your analysis. So I want to take you back through the steps. You had step number 1, where you had to explicate the poem. Step number 2, where you had to divide and conquer. Step number 3 is where you really want to make sure that you're answering the question in its entirety. Step number 4 requires you to take a look at your techniques as you were writing them and not only identify them, but to also discuss the impact that each of your techniques have on that particular line or stanza. And the final one requires you to take that same technique and decide and determine how that contributes to the poem as a whole.